The first thing anyone ever told Jeff Reese about himself was that there was something wrong with his head. Not wrong like crooked, not wrong like soft. Wrong like the doctor in the colony's one medical bay had gone very still when he pulled back the birthing cloth, and then used a voice that sounded like a person trying not to use a particular voice. Jeff's mother always said the doctor had been kind about it. Jeff suspected kindness was just what they called it when no one knew what else to be. He was born without a proper cranial plate. The skin was there, thin, pale, stretched across the dome of his skull the way cling film stretches across a bowl. But beneath it, visible in certain lights, the corrugated surface of his brain moved like something alive. Which it was. Which was the problem. He had no hair. He never would. The colony medical records listed him as the most extreme case of congenital cranial agenesis in recorded settlement history, which was a long way of saying, "We have never seen anything like this, and we are not entirely sure what to do with you." What they did with him was school, then the mines, then the occupation. The Veth came when Jeff was 8 years old. He remembered it the way you remember things that happen when you're 8, in fragments and feelings rather than sequence. The sound first, low and sustained, like a bass note played by something the size of a mountain. Then the light, which wasn't light so much as the absence of shadow, everywhere at once, every corner of Blaine-Gwent colony lit from above with that flat white non-light that made everything look like evidence. Then the ships, which he'd expected to be like the ships in the serials he watched, sleek and tapered and fast. They weren't. They were wide and slow and heavy, and they descended the way big things descend, without apology. His mother had pulled him inside and pressed his face against her shoulder, and he'd felt the low vibration of the ships through the floor, through her rib cage, through the thin skin of his skull. And something, even then, at 8, standing in the kitchen with the mugs rattling in the cabinet, something in that vibration had felt almost like a word he couldn't quite hear. The Veth took 3 days to secure Blaine-Gwent. They weren't cruel about it. That was the thing people never quite knew how to explain afterward, to people who hadn't been there. There was no burning, no executions in the square. The Veth simply arrived and adjusted the parameters of human life the way you'd adjust the thermostat in a house you'd bought. Curfews, movement restrictions, output quotas for the mines, because the colony sat on the second largest seam of gravitite ore in the settled systems, and the Veth were nothing if not efficient.
And the towers. The towers went up in the first week.
6 of them, spaced evenly across the colony, tall and tapered and humming,
At a frequency that Jeff could never quite locate.
low enough to feel in your back teeth, high enough to sound if you caught it on a quiet night, almost musical. The Veth called them coordination infrastructure. The humans called them the hum, which was accurate but not complete, because what the towers actually did, what it took the Resistance 3 years and a captured Veth technical to figure out, was broadcast a continuous pacification signal across the colony's entire frequency range. Not mind control, nothing so dramatic, just a steady low-level signal that shaved the edges off everything, made people calmer, more compliant, more willing to go back to the mines in the morning and not ask too many questions about who the ore was going to. Everyone received it, except Jeff. He didn't know this for a long time. He thought the tiredness he saw in people's faces was just what occupation did to a person. He thought the flatness in his mother's eyes was grief. His father had died in the 3rd year, a roof collapse in Shaft 7. Nothing to do with the Veth, just the mine being what it always had been. He thought the way conversations in Blaine-Gwent seemed to stop at the edges, never pushing anywhere interesting, never catching fire, was just what happened when people were hungry and scared and working 12-hour shifts underground. He didn't figure it out until he was 19 and couldn't sleep, and walked out of the family unit at 2 in the morning because the dark hours were the only hours that felt like his own. The curfew officially ended at 4. Unofficially, if you stayed on the residential terraces and didn't go near the perimeter wire, the Veth patrols were sparse enough past midnight that a careful person could move. Jeff had always been careful. Unremarkable was the same as invisible, and Jeff had spent his whole life practicing unremarkable. He wore his cap low, always had, since the day at school when Carwin Davies had pulled it off and made the whole class stare, and the girls had screamed, not in mockery but in genuine alarm, which was somehow worse. He kept his head down. He did his quota. He came home, but at night, in the streets with no one watching, he took the cap off. He didn't know why it helped. It just did. The night air on his scalp was something he had no word for. Not cold exactly, not warm. The closest he'd ever gotten was the way a question feels right before the answer, like his brain was listening for something that hadn't arrived yet. The moon over Blangwent was the same moon as always, the colony's tidally locked primary satellite, chalk-white and pocked and enormous on the horizon. Jeff had never paid it much attention. It was just there, the way the mountains were just there, the way the mine elevator towers were just there. Background. The first night he felt it, he stopped walking and stood very still in the middle of Stridefar with his cap in his hand and his head tilted back, and thought, what is that? Not a sound. Not exactly. More like a texture. A frequency that arrived, not through his ears, but through the exposed surface of his skull. Through the thin membrane over his cortex, as if his brain were an antenna that someone had just bothered to point in the right direction. It was faint. It was there. It hummed at the edge of perception the way the Veth towers hummed, but different. Not the low sedating pulse of the pacification signal, which he now realized he had always been able to feel without knowing what it was. Like a smell you've lived with so long you stop noticing. This was directional. This was specific. This was coming from somewhere, and it had content. He stood there for 20 minutes. Then he put his cap back on and walked home and lay in bed until morning, staring at the ceiling, thinking, I need to talk to someone. The problem was that talking to someone about the thing you heard in your head at 2 in the morning, standing in the street with your skull exposed to the moonlight, was not the kind of conversation that ended well for anyone. He waited 3 weeks. He went out every night. By the end of the 3rd week, he understood. Not in words, not yet, but in the way you understand a map before you can name the streets. That what he was receiving was structured. It cycled. Patterns repeated. There were peaks and troughs, dense clusters of signal and quiet intervals, and the quiet intervals arrived on a schedule that he could set his internal clock to. He told Maisie Hughes on a Wednesday. Maisie worked the same shift on the number 3 conveyor. 12 hours of sorting gravitite from slag, which was loud and boring, and left your hands gray to the wrist. She was 22, from the Hafod side of the colony, and she had the kind of face that was always in the middle of thinking something she hadn't decided whether to say yet. Jeff trusted her because she was the only person at the number 3 conveyor who still argued. Everyone else had gone flat. Maisie still argued about the ore weigh-in, about the break allocation, about the quality of the food in the canteen. Small arguments. Useless arguments. But arguments, she was still in there. I need to tell you something, Jeff said, in the canteen during the 11 o'clock break, and I need you not to look at my head funny when I do. Maisie looked at his head. She had always looked at his head. Not the staring, flinching look he'd gotten from strangers his whole life, but a frank, interested look, like a person examining a piece of engineering they found impressive. Go on then, he told her. She was quiet for a long time. The canteen noise went on around them, scraping chairs, the wet sound of food, the distant hum of the ventilation system. Then she said, You're receiving their signal. I think so. From the towers? No. The towers are, I can feel those too. It's like background. It's everywhere. This is different. This is coming from above. From the coordination satellites, I think, the ones that talk to the towers. Maisie looked at him for a while. Then she said, Jeff, I know. Jeff, if that's true, I know. That's the command net. He'd known by that point. He hadn't let himself say it, because saying it made it a thing that required action, and Jeff Reese had spent 19 years carefully not requiring action. But yes, the structured signal, the cycling patterns, the scheduled quiet intervals, those weren't the pacification broadcast. Those were orders. Coordination. The operational nervous system of the Veth occupation of Blangwent colony, and possibly, he was beginning to suspect, of much more than just Blangwent. Yeah, he said. I think so. Maisie put down her cup. She looked at him the way people look at someone who has just handed them something they don't know how to carry. Then she said, I know some people. He had not wanted her to know some people. He had specifically, in his internal pre-conversation planning, hoped that Maisie's response would be along the lines of, Well, that's strange. You ought to see a doctor. And then he could say, probably right, and the conversation would be over, and he could go back to being unremarkable. Instead, she knew some people. The people she knew were called the Blangwent Active Resistance, which was a name that sounded more organized than it was. They met in the decommissioned miners' canteen on the Hafod side, the old one, from the original settlement that had been replaced when the number 2 shaft opened, and no one had gotten around to knocking down. It had been a working men's club before it was a canteen, and before that Jeff wasn't sure. But there were still old photographs on the wall of people who looked like his grandfather standing in groups with their arms around each other and pints raised, looking at the camera like they owned it. He found the photographs comforting. He wasn't sure why. There were 7 of them that first night. Maisie, a man named Di Price, who was big and quiet and had the hands of someone who'd been mining since before Jeff was born. A young woman named Sorcha, who'd come to Blangwent from one of the outer settlements and had a way of taking notes on a folded piece of paper that made everything she wrote look like a diagram. 2 brothers named Callum and who finished each other's sentences in a way that wasn't annoying because they never wasted words between them. A woman named Mrs. Perry, who was 60-something, had run the original canteen and brought biscuits to the meeting without explanation or apology. And a man named Gruff, who seemed to be in charge, or at least was the person everyone looked at when someone said something uncertain. Jeff sat down. Mrs. Perry put a biscuit in front of him. He looked at Maisie. "Tell them what you told me," Maisie said. He told them. There was a silence that felt different from the silence in the canteen at work. That silence was the silence of people who had been smoothed out. This silence was the silence of people thinking hard about something that had just changed the shape of their problem. Gruff said, "Can you read it? Interpret it?" "Not yet. I can feel the structure. I can tell when it's dense and when it's quiet. The quiet intervals, I think those are when orders have gone out and been acknowledged. The dense clusters are. I think those are active coordination. Movement. Movement of what? I don't know. I'd need more time. I'd need to map it, I suppose. Correlate what I'm feeling with what's actually happening on the ground. Figure out what the patterns correspond to." Gruff looked at Di. Di looked at the table. Sorcha was already writing on her folded paper. "You'd need to be outside," Gruff said, "at night. For long periods. Yes, that's a risk. I know. We'd need to keep you safe." Jeff hadn't expected that. He'd expected, "This is valuable intelligence. We'll organize it tactically." He hadn't expected, "We'd need to keep you safe," said in the same tone his mother used when she checked the locks at night. He looked at Gruff. Gruff looked back at him without any particular expression. "Right?" Jeff said. "Okay." What followed was 3 months that Jeff would later describe when people asked as the strangest period of his life, and then immediately correct himself and say, "No, wait. The whole war was the strangest period of my life, but those 3 months were the strangest of the strange." Every night after curfew officially started but before the Veth patrol cycles peaked, Jeff went out onto the Hafid terraces with his cap in his hand and his head tilted back, and he listened. Sorcha sat beside him with her folded paper and wrote down everything he said. Callum and Who walked perimeter 50 meters away, moving slowly, looking like people who had forgotten something and were looking for it. Mrs. Perry made tea in the decommissioned canteen and kept the window light low enough to be invisible from the street. It was strange, and it was mundane, and it was, Jeff thought, on the nights when the signal was loud and clear and almost not beautiful, wrong word, but something like beautiful. It was the most connected he had ever felt to something. Not to the Veth. To the fact that the universe was full of things talking to each other, full of signals crossing the dark, and some of them were now passing through him. The thin skin over his cortex had been a source of shame his entire life. The cap, the flinching, the careful unremarkability. The way a cold day could make him feel his own brain pushing against the inside of his skull, which was a sensation no one else he knew could describe, and which he had always assumed was just another thing that was wrong with him. Now, lying on the cold stones of the Hafod terrace with Sorcha's pencil scratching beside him, and the moon enormous and white overhead, and the signal coming through him like a current, it occurred to him, for the first time, that being born without a skull plate was not a defect. It was a receiver. He tried to explain this to Maisie once, on the walk back to the residential units at 3 in the morning. She listened. Then she said, "Bit much, Jeff. I know. We can all tell when you're having a moment, by the way. You go very still, and you get this look on your face." "What look?" "Like you've just worked out the answer to something, like a very bald maths teacher." He laughed. He hadn't laughed in a long time. It surprised him. The mapping took 12 weeks. By the end of it, Sorcha had filled 6 sheets of folded paper, front and back, with symbols that looked like music notation crossed with a weather map. And Jeff could sit in the decommissioned canteen and say, with reasonable confidence, things like, "There's a patrol rotation change coming in the next 48 hours, I think, toward the eastern perimeter," and be right. Or, The signal went very quiet last night for about 20 minutes, which I haven't seen before. And 3 days later, Gruff would come back from a contact in the next colony over and say the Veth had pulled a garrison unit north. Exactly the kind of movement that would produce a 20-minute command silence at the local level. The resistance in Blangwent began to trust him, more than trust him, to build around him. The meeting nights in the decommissioned canteen expanded. There were 15 people now, then 20, then 30. People brought food. Mrs. Perry had found a tea urn somewhere, and it sat on the old serving counter and steamed, and Jeff would sit in the middle of the room with his cap off. He'd stopped wearing it to meetings, somewhere in the second month, without making a decision about it, just arriving one night without it and no one saying anything, and he would talk through what he'd heard the night before, and Sorcha would translate it into something that looked like a map, and Gruff would make plans. It felt, and Jeff was aware, this was an odd thing to feel about a clandestine resistance meeting in an occupied mining colony. It felt like the photographs on the wall, the ones of his grandfather's generation with their arms around each other and their pints raised. This is what those were. Not the pub specifically, not the beer, the gathering. The reason to be in the same place, together, in the dark, doing something that mattered. He said something like this to Maisie once. She said, "You're going soft, Jeff. Am I wrong?" She looked at the room, at Mrs. Perry refilling cups, at Callum and Hu arguing in their economical way about a patrol route, at Di Price, who had barely said 10 words in 3 months of meetings, sitting with his big quiet hands wrapped around his mug and his eyes following the conversation, with an alertness that Jeff now recognized as the look of a man who had been flat for a long time and was now coming back. "No," Maisie said, "you're not wrong." The Veth noticed something was wrong in the 4th month, not Jeff specifically. They didn't know about Jeff. They knew that the Blangwent active resistance had begun operating with a tactical precision that was inconsistent with the colony's apparent level of organization. Small things first, a supply run that took a route the Veth patrol wasn't on. A meeting broken up before it could be broken up, everyone gone before the sweep team arrived. A piece of equipment that disappeared from a Veth storage depot 20 minutes before a schedule change that should have made the depot unassailable. Jeff knew the Veth knew because the signal changed. The coordination chatter became denser, more frequent. The quiet intervals disappeared. Something was paying attention, he told Gruff. Gruff said, "How long do we have? Before what? Before they find us." Jeff thought about it. The signal had a texture when it was searching. He'd learned to feel the difference between operational traffic and investigative traffic. The way you can tell by the sound of footsteps, whether someone is walking somewhere or looking for something. They're not looking here yet, they're casting wide. But the density is increasing. A month maybe, less if we make a mistake. Gruff nodded. He was quiet for a while. Then he said, "There's something we've been waiting to act on. We weren't ready. I think we need to decide if we'll ever be ready, or if we just have to go." He told Jeff what it was. The Veth coordination satellite, not the ones Jeff received. Those were the network nodes, the relays, but the primary transmission hub, the anchor of the whole signal architecture for this sector of the settled systems. It was in geosynchronous orbit above Blangwent. It had been there since week 1 of the occupation. It was the reason Blangwent had been the first colony secured. The ore was valuable, yes, but the geography was perfect for an anchor point. Take out the anchor and the signal network for 11 colonies degraded to 40% capacity. The pacification broadcast weakened. The command net fragmented. The resistance had known about it since year 2. They'd had no way to reach it. Jeff said, "I can feel it." Gruff looked at him. "I've been feeling it all along. I thought it was just more signal. Background. But it's not the same as the towers. It's higher, more compressed. It's the hub." He paused. "I think I can feel when it's running maintenance cycles. There are these moments, maybe twice a month, when everything drops. Everything. Even the pacification broadcast, maybe 30 seconds. Maybe 40, 30 seconds. The whole system reboots. It's very brief. But during that window, if there were something already in position, already in orbit, the debris field from the old mining survey ships, half a dozen hulks up there, they've been there since before the colony. The Veth have never moved them because they're not a threat. They're just junk." Gruff was very still. "If one of those hulks had a payload," Jeff said, "and if that payload were set to release precisely at the moment the hub went into its maintenance cycle, timed to the second, while the hub's point defense was offline, you'd need to know the exact second. Not the approximate window, the exact second. Yes. Can you do that? Jeff had been thinking about this since approximately the moment Gruff started talking. He had been thinking about the fact that the maintenance cycle, when it came, felt like a held breath. A sudden absence that lasted exactly as long as it lasted, which was different each time, but whose onset was always preceded by a very specific pattern in the signal. A triplet compression, a brief silence, and then the drop. He'd felt it 17 times now. He knew the feeling the way he knew the feeling of a conveyor belt that was about to jam, not because he'd been told, but because his body had learned it. Yes, he said, I can do that. What came next required things that Jeff was not good at. Logistics, coordination with people he'd never met, trust extended in multiple directions at once. The resistance had contacts he hadn't known about. The hulks in the debris field had been quietly visited over the preceding year by people doing things that looked, from below, like scavenging. They were not scavenging. Jeff's role in the plan as Gruff finally laid it out was the simplest possible role. Stand on the roof of the decommissioned canteen, cap off, head tilted back, and wait. And when the maintenance cycle began, when he felt the triplet compression, the brief silence, the drop, press a button on a radio handset that would send a single signal to the modified Hulk that Di Price and two people Jeff had never met had spent 3 weeks positioning in the debris field's edge. Simple. Except for the 30 Veth ground troops that had been moved into the half-odd quarter the day before. The density of the command net traffic had peaked the previous night. Jeff had felt it and said nothing until morning because he hadn't wanted to say it, and then Gruff had walked in and looked at his face and said, "How bad? They're moving on half-odd. I don't know when. Maybe tonight, maybe tomorrow. They've narrowed it down to this side of the colony. They don't know about this building? I don't think so. Not yet. Then we go tonight." The problem was that the maintenance cycle was not predictable in terms of date, only in terms of onset signature. It could come tonight. It could come in 4 days. Jeff had never been able to forecast it more than a few minutes ahead of when it actually arrived. "So we wait on the roof," Gruff said. "Until it comes. That could be. However long it takes." Jeff looked at him. Gruff looked back. Around them, the decommissioned canteen was very quiet. Everyone had been sent away, except Maisie and Di, who would serve as lookouts at the building's 2 exits, and Sorcha, who had brought her folded papers and was sitting at the old serving counter in case any of Jeff's verbal observations needed mapping, though both of them knew that tonight there would be no time for mapping. Mrs. Perry had also refused to leave. She was at the tea urn. She handed Jeff a mug without asking whether he wanted one. "Go up," she said. "I'll keep the kettle on." It took 2 hours and 40 minutes. Jeff stood on the roof of the decommissioned canteen in the cold night of Blangwent Colony, with his cap in his left hand and the radio handset in his right, and the moon enormous overhead, and the signal moving through him like a river through a channel it had always been meant to fill. He could feel the full complexity of it now. The pacification broadcast, which he felt as something dull and omnidirectional, like being inside a sound. The coordination net, which he felt as texture and structure, directional, purposeful, and above it all, further up and more compressed, the hub, which he felt as a presence rather than a signal, the way you feel the sun behind cloud cover, not light but weight. He knew the Veth patrol was sweeping the next street over. He could feel the net traffic that correspond to a patrol in motion. He'd mapped it. He knew the pattern. 6 minutes, maybe 7, before they reached the outer edge of the Hayfod sector, he stood and waited. The moon was the same moon it had always been, chalk-white and enormous and old. He thought, not for the first time, about being 8 years old and standing in the kitchen with his mother's arms around him and feeling the vibration of the Veth ships through the floor. He thought about the thing he'd felt even then, the suggestion of a signal, or the suggestion of an ear that could hear signals not intended for it. He thought about Carwin Davies pulling his cap off and the girls screaming. He thought about 12 years of keeping his head down and staying unremarkable. He thought about Maisie's voice. "We can all tell when you're having a moment." He thought about the photographs on the wall inside. The arms around shoulders, the pints raised. Then he felt it. Triplet compression. Faint but unmistakable. The specific tightening of the signal texture that he had felt 17 times and now felt for the 18th time. The system gathering itself before the drop. The last few milliseconds of normal operation before the maintenance cycle pulled everything offline. The hub holding its breath. Jeff pressed the button. The silence was total. Not just the signal silence, The actual silence, the physical silence of Blangwent at 3 in the morning, the cold air, the distant tick of the ventilation towers. He stood in it. He counted. Then, high above him, something moved against the stars, not a streak, not an explosion. You couldn't see an explosion from the ground against the scale of it. Just a small adjustment in the arrangement of light in the debris field. A subtle shifting of reflections, there and then not there and then. The hub signal didn't come back. He stood and waited for another full minute. The maintenance cycle window came and went. The coordination net traffic, which should have resumed, which always resumed, which had resumed 17 times before, in that specific recognizable way that meant the system was back online, did not resume. The pacification broadcast was still there. It would be for a while. The towers had local power. They'd run on backup for days. But the hub was down. The towers were now broadcasting into a void, their signal uncoordinated and unencored. In 11 colonies across this sector of the settled systems, the command net was degrading. The garrison units were operating on their last received orders, which were now hours old. The Veth in Blangwent had 60 armed troops, and their last instruction, which was to sweep the Hafid sector, which they would still do, because troops follow the last order they have, but with no hub, no updates, no coordination with the orbital assets that made the Veth ground operations so precise. Impropesion, Jeff had learned, was how you killed a machine. He heard the Veth patrol come around the corner below, and he lay flat on the roof and did not breathe. The patrol passed. He heard it stop, heard the communication attempt, the handheld units trying to reach the coordination net and getting noise, heard the brief exchange in Veth that he didn't speak but whose tone he recognized. Confusion, and under the confusion, something beginning to bend toward fear. He waited until they moved on. Then he climbed back down to the decommissioned canteen. The room was very still. Gruff was standing. Maisie was standing. Die Price was standing with his hands at his sides and his eyes on Jeff. Sorcha had her pencil suspended above her paper, not writing. Mrs. Perry was at the tea urn. Jeff set the radio handset on the serving counter. He said, "It's down." Nobody spoke for a moment. Then Die Price, who had said perhaps 30 words in 4 months, said, "You sure?" "Yes." Die nodded slowly. He reached up and rubbed the back of his neck with one big gray hand. Then he said, "Right then," which was, Jeff thought, about right. What happened in the following weeks was not clean or easy or safe, because nothing in the real world is. The Veth garrison fought. Of course they fought. They were soldiers, and soldiers without a command net don't stop being soldiers. They just stop being coordinated. They were dangerous, and they were there for another 9 days before the combined resistance of 6 colonies, operating with a coordination that the Veth could no longer match, managed what 3 years of armed resistance had not. A simultaneous action across multiple sectors that the Veth command structure, fragmented and running on old orders, could not counter. There were casualties. Jeff knew some of them. He did not do the thing where he listed them here, because he'd found that listing names made them specific and small, and they deserved to be the size they actually were. He was there when the last Veth garrison ship left Blangwent. He stood on the Hafod terrace with his cap in his hand, because it was a clear day and the sun was on his head, and it felt important not to cover it. And he watched the ship go up and up until it was smaller than a star, and then nothing. Maisie stood beside him. Gruff stood behind them. Mrs. Perry, somewhere nearby, was talking to someone about what to do with all the tea she'd made. "What do you hear?" Maisie said. Jeff tilted his head. The hum of the towers, which were still running. They'd take months to properly decommission. The absence of the hub, which he felt as a kind of openness in the sky, a frequency that no longer had anything on it. The ordinary radio traffic of humans talking to humans, which was its own kind of signal, less structured, less purposeful, but warmer. "Not much," he said. "Just us."
Good.
She put her arm around his shoulder. He put his arm around hers. They stood there for a while in the sun. Later, much later, after the inquiry and the Reconstruction Commission, and the long, careful work of disassembling 6 years of occupation infrastructure, someone from the government of the settled systems asked Jeff to give an account of his role in the Blangwent action. He sat across a long table from a row of people with tablets and serious faces and told them what he'd told everyone who'd asked. The bare facts, in order, without embellishment. At the end, one of the serious faces said, "Mr. Reese, to summarize, the defeat of the Veth coordination network in this sector came down, ultimately, to the fact that you were born without a cranial plate." Jeff thought about it. "And the patience," he said. "You need the patience." The serious face wrote something on its tablet. On the way out, Maisie, who had accompanied him as a material witness and had spent the entire proceeding writing increasingly detailed doodles on her own copy of the commission's preliminary report, said, "The patience." Very profound, Jeff. Felt like the right thing to say. Could have mentioned the rest of us. You were all there in the patience bit. She considered this. Fair enough. He put his cap back on. He still wore it sometimes in crowds because some habits were about comfort and not shame, and there was no law against being comfortable, and they walked out into the rebuilt streets of Blangwent, which smelled like dust and construction, and somewhere, from one of the reopened shops near the old canteen, tea. The mountains were still there. The mine elevator towers were still there. The moon would be up in 6 hours. Weird, though, wasn't it? Ended up being the most useful bloke in the war. Just a man from Wales who couldn't grow hair and happened to be born without a skull plate, and one night found out that what everyone had called a defect was actually the thing the whole sector needed, sitting there on top of his shoulders the whole time, waiting for someone to aim it at the right sky. He thought about that a lot in the years after, about the signals things give off, about the ears we're born with, the ones we know about and the ones we don't, the ones that work on frequencies nobody expected, about the fact that the universe was full of things talking to each other, crossing the dark, and you never knew who was listening. He never stopped going out at night. Even after the towers came down, even after the hub was replaced with something human-made and open and good, he still walked the half-odd terraces after midnight with his cap off and his head tilted back. The signal was different now, quieter, less structured, just the natural radio noise of space, and the warm chatter of human communications, and the faint occasional suggestion of something further out, something that might have been another signal from another direction, something that might have been the edge of another conversation he hadn't learned the shape of yet. He didn't chase it, not yet, he just listened.